Hello YouTube, this is Scraps from GriffinMods, and this is our in-depth mod guide for the Nerf Elite Strongarm. Today we're going to be covering barrel post removal to allow compatibility for any kind of dart. We're going to port out the openings in the back of the turret to allow for rear loading. We're also going to remove the turret lock and smooth out the priming mechanism to make it a little bit more comfortable. And most importantly, we're going to be doing a spring replacement. To get started, you first need to remove all the screws. It's pretty straightforward on the Strongarm because there's no hidden screws and all the screws are the same size. A number 0 screwdriver will work just fine, or I like to use an electric whenever I can just to speed things up a bit. We'll start out by taking a look at the barrel turret, which just lifts straight out like this. Once you've removed your barrel turret, we can continue to break it down by sliding this piece off the end. Luckily, it's not fitted with a metal rod and two pressure-fitted end caps that you have to pry apart with a screwdriver, so that just slides right off. And then here, you can see in the back of the barrel turret, there is, I believe, 3 deep screw wells right here that we'll have to undo to further get this thing apart. I've removed the screws from the back of the barrel turret, and there were actually only 2 as opposed to 3, and luckily they were very small screws like the ones in the rest of the blaster, and so they didn't take very long to get out. Unfortunately, I spoke a little too soon about not having to pry anything apart, because this top piece of the barrel turret, it's on this kind of zippered line that goes across the front here, was pretty hard to get out. After I took the screws out, it was pressure fitted in there very tightly. I wound up having to get a small flathead and slowly pry it apart, going around the circumference of the turret, and even then it was still pretty hard to get apart. So just be forewarned that that's not going to come out easily. Once you finally do get it off, it's very similar to the front of the turret in a Maverick. And inside, you can see we have our barrel posts. There's no air restrictors because the air restrictor is actually in the plunger tube, but we'll get to that later. So those are the barrel posts we're going to be removing for the rear loading and also to enable this blaster to accept any kind of dart. And you can also see there's a single black screw there in the back that holds on this gray piece that we're going to be removing next. The same number 0 screwdriver should be able to take care of that. I'm going to remove each of the barrel posts to allow for compatibility for streamlines and also Stefan darts and pretty much any other kind of Nerf dart. In order to remove the barrel posts, it's very simple. You can use a Dremel. I'm actually going to use these little snippers that I have right here, and I'm just going to cut either side of the barrel post, and they'll just pop right out. To make the Strongarm capable of rear loading is actually quite simple once you've removed the barrel posts and completely disassembled the barrel turret. All you have to do is come in and sand down the inside edge of each of these openings just wide enough to allow a dart to pass through. I've already done these 2 right here at the top, and you can see how little you actually have to shave off to allow clearance for a dart to pass through. You want to make sure you don't take too much off or you're going to mess up your air seal when the plunger tube moves forward. So I just took my Dremel with a small diameter sanding bit and shaved down a little bit at a time until they were just wide enough to allow darts to pass through. If I put the turret back together, you can see that there's no need to shave down the tops of the openings because they're already plenty wide enough. You only have to shave down the areas below where the bracket for the barrel posts were. And these are the 2 that I did. You can see that those are shaved down just wide enough to be flush with each of the barrels. And then these are the ones I haven't done yet. And it's only, I'd say, a millimeter or so that you need to take off at the bottom of the opening. Now that each of these have been opened up, the next thing I'm going to do is take the barrels themselves and this conical shaped sanding bit from my Dremel. And I'm not going to sand inside the barrels at all. I'm just going to flare out the openings ever so slightly to allow the darts to feed a little bit better. After that, I'm going to come back with some fine grit sandpaper and smooth out all the surfaces that I've worked on. This is our reassembled barrel turret, and you can see we now have nice clean holes through the back of each of the barrels, and you'll also notice this little tab right here. This is the same tab that was on the Maverick that prevented the barrel turret from popping all the way out. The Strongarm actually has it on both sides. If you wanted to, you could remove those and it would allow the barrel turret to pop out a little bit farther. However, even if you did, you could still only access two of the barrels completely at a time unless you come back in and actually take a chunk out of the bracket here. So unless you're doing that, there's really no reason to take those tabs off. Now let's talk about the internals. You can see that much like the Rampage, most everything is contained in one centralized housing right here. If you remove this black screw from the trigger, you can essentially lift everything out in pretty much one solid piece. But before you start moving a bunch of stuff around, I want to point out that your catch spring is actually located right here behind the catch. And that's the first thing that's going to try to jump out at you, so you want to be careful of that so that you don't lose it. Also, this small spring here that's the return spring for the plunger tube is another one that likes to jump out at you, so you may want to remove that before you start disassembling the blaster. This is the new gear system that's responsible for rotating the turret after you fire the blaster. It's composed of the gear system here, this rod, this triangle, and this return spring down here. The way that it operates is there's a piece about halfway down the plunger rod that comes into contact with this triangle while you're priming the blaster and pulls it back. And you'll notice that while I'm pulling it back, the gear system doesn't rotate. It merely sets up the rotation mechanism, and then once it's fired, this returns, and the full rotation takes place on the return of that arm. And that's how it rotates after it fires. This piece right here is pretty much the only lock in the whole blaster. It starts here at the front, it runs all the way back here, behind the trigger, and underneath your trigger catch. And the way that it works is, in the forward position here, it's as if the turret was out of the blaster, and it won't allow the trigger catch to move all the way down. Once the barrel turret's returned, it'll push this back and allow full range of motion for the trigger catch. So, this being one solid piece, I think I'm just going to remove it altogether. To get at this lock, all you have to do is remove the trigger by taking out this one screw right here. Now the trigger just lifts out, and you can pull this rod out. The best way is to get at it from the back, and then you can slide it and just kind of wiggle it out of its bracket up front. I've gone ahead and temporarily replaced the trigger and removed the mainspring so that I can more effectively show you exactly how the single fire and slam fire features of this blaster operate. As you pull the trigger, it moves the trigger catch down, and the trigger catch actually serves a dual purpose because these wings right here serve as your priming indicator. The part most directly responsible for the slam fire feature is this new advanced plunger rod. You'll notice that there's no metal bar running from either side of the slide like there is in a Maverick, and that's because the end of this plunger rod has these little wings sticking off the sides, and those connect to these tiny triangles on the inside of either side of the slide, and those are what actually pull the plunger rod back when you prime the blaster. You'll also notice that the end of the plunger rod here is hinged and moves up and down. It also has this tooth, which is what actually catches on the trigger catch. As you prime the blaster, this is the piece right here that engages the gear arm for the rotation mechanism. I'm going to go ahead and bypass that, and then as you prime it for normal firing, you can see the end of the plunger rod moves up and catches on the trigger catch. Then when you would fire it for single fire, the trigger catch simply moves down and releases the plunger rod. I've removed a few of the springs so that I can better illustrate for you exactly how the slam fire operates. The way it works is, when the trigger catch is down like this, as if you were holding down the trigger, and you're priming the blaster for slam fire, once you get to the end of the draw, the top piece of the trigger catch here actually forces down the end of the plunger rod, causing these wings to slip from the triangle pieces that are pulling them back, and that allows the plunger rod to return forward while the slides are still backwards in the prime position. Continuing with the disassembly, once you remove the trigger, your trigger catch just lifts out, assuming you've already removed the spring, and this whole unit here just lifts straight up, and it comes right out. To remove the plunger tube, just be mindful of the little return spring here, and you turn it about a quarter turn towards you, and then just kind of wiggle it up at an angle, and it pops right out. At a glance, it would appear as though this plunger system has an air restrictor, a small hole that needs filled right here, and a whole bunch of dead space that needs taken care of because you can see where the O-ring is and how much space is left between it and the front of the plunger tube. In reality, however, none of those things are true. Let me explain. When you look at the front of the plunger tube, you'll notice the tooth right here that's connected to a plate inside the plunger tube, and you'll also notice this semicircle structure over the hole. If you remove the plunger rod and look inside, you can see the circular structure there in the center, and if you look through it, you can probably see the tiny hole that's in the plate that the tooth is attached to. You'll also notice that the plate itself is not disc-shaped like normal air restrictors. It's actually rectangular, and that's because it's not an air restrictor at all. It is a rapid air release designed to allow as much airflow as possible through and around the system when it's opened. The reason for the circular structure there in the center is simply to house the spring and to allow range of motion for the system. The reason for the circular structure there in the front is to block that hole in the center of the plate when the system's closed, and that'll allow no air to come out of the system whatsoever except for this tiny little hole on the side. And what the tiny hole does is it provides protection against dry fire. If you're firing the blaster with no dart, then there is nothing to open the air release, and you have a whole bunch of air trapped inside your plunger system. This allows the air to slowly escape and allows you to safely dry fire your blaster. The real beauty of it is, when you do have a dart loaded and you fire it and the plunger system moves forward, the plate actually covers the hole from the inside and doesn't allow any air to escape through it, which means 100% of your air is coming through the front of the tube and affecting your dart. The other cool thing is that the plunger face is very similar to the plunger face in other Elite blasters, except this one has been designed specifically to match up perfectly to that circular structure inside the tube and offer as little dead space as humanly possible. And that is why you don't want to alter this system whatsoever. If you drill out this plate and remove the pieces on the front, it's going to mess up the timing of the plunger tube moving forward, and you're actually going to lose a large quantity of your air before you make a seal against the back of the cylinder. Moving on to the plunger itself, I can give you guys a little bit better look at these wings here that are vital to the slam fire and even basic priming of the blaster. You can also see more clearly the pivot point that allows for the end of the plunger rod to move up and down. You'll also notice that it has a very beefy O-ring. It's much thicker than the O-rings that Nerf traditionally uses, and that offers a nearly perfect air seal on the inside of the plunger tube. When removing the spring, you'll notice that it has these little tiny nubs on the front that keep it nested up against the plunger face and prevent it from moving around. So to get it off, you just pull it free of those nubs, and then you can work it around the wings on the back of the plunger rod and thread it off the end. I was surprised to find that this spring is not very heavy. It seems like a lighter spring than the stock spring that was in the Retaliator or the Rampage, and that just goes to show you how efficient the Strongarm is in its use of air volume. Now, I thought because of the clearances that are necessary that it was going to be tough to find a replacement spring for this blaster. Luckily, that turned out not to be the case. Orange Modworks had recently put several of their springs on clearance sale, so I picked up a bunch of them, and it just so happens that one of the springs I picked up, the 6 kilogram Swarmfire spring, is a nearly perfect replacement for the stock Strongarm spring. You can see here that it's nearly identical in terms of the diameter, and the length is pretty close too, so I think it should work out just fine. When you're installing the new spring and you're trying to get it over the little nubs that hold it in place, I've found it helpful to use a small screwdriver and just apply a little bit of pressure, and they'll pop right over and lock in place. For the last modification we're going to be doing, it's necessary to remove the slide from the other half of the shell. To do that, you first have to unhook the return spring. The return spring screws into the slide itself right here and then hooks over this peg on the inside of the shell. So to remove it, you just have to slide it off of the peg on the inside of the shell, and then you can pull the slide right off. The modification that we're going to be doing involves these ridges here on the top of the blaster. These ridges are to provide you a little bit of extra grip when you're firing. The problem is they actually roll over the side, and they're not just on the top. And here where they come over the side, they're very pointy, and it was starting to rub my hands raw when I was slam firing the Strongarm. So we're not going to take the ridges off altogether, but I am going to take my sanding bit and I'm going to take down just the edges of them here where they've been cutting into my hand, and hopefully that'll make things a little bit more comfortable. Now you can see that we have a very smooth edge right here. I just took it down a little bit with the sanding bit from my Dremel and then cleaned it up with some sandpaper, and it should be much more comfortable at this point, especially for slam fire. And all that's left is to put everything back together. A quick note on reassembly: when you're reinstalling your trigger catch, this little window right here is to allow you to put the trigger catch spring back in. When you install it, make sure that it's in the upwards position, and then you can just take your catch spring and feed it up through the hole towards the top, and it goes right in place. Now that we've reassembled the strong arm, let me show you how it performs. First up, the rear loading. You can in fact rear load Elite darts. However, because the tips are so wide and the barrels themselves are tapered, it's still probably more effective to load Elite darts from the front. What the rear loading is good for is Steffens, because you have a smaller diameter tip and because it's necessary to seat the darts all the way back in the barrel in order to deactivate that air release. Rear loading Steffens is not only effective, it's much easier and better to do that way than loading them from the front. So if you're planning on using custom darts, I highly recommend the rear loading mod. As far as the priming goes, the slide is much more comfortable without those ridges on there, and you can definitely tell it's got a heavier spring, but it's not heavy enough that I think it'll affect the slam fire at all. Before we go outside for the ranges, I wanted to show you guys a real quick before and after firing comparison. This is an unmodified strong arm. And this is our modified strong arm. And you can see there's a very clear difference in the velocity and the amount of power behind each dart. For the ranges, as usual, we'll be using stock Elite darts. However, because the Elite blasters are so powerful that pretty much any time you do a spring replacement, the power level exceeds the capabilities of the Elite darts and they start to fishtail out of control, we will also be doing a second range test with Elite stingers. All that the Elite stingers are normal Elite darts with the tips filled with hot glue, and that gives them a little bit of extra weight at the end and allows them to better handle more powerful blasters. We're also going to be doing a third range test with 50 cal slugs. These come from an Australian company called Velocity Tag, and I call them 50 cals because that's the name of the tip that we're using. They're a solid silicone tip, and they're weighted to about 1.5 grams, and we're going to be using these for a couple of reasons. One, they're a good analog for Steffen darts, and two, I think they're going to be my new standard, and I want to see how they perform in the strong arm. I'm not going to go into any more detail about the darts themselves, because I'm eventually going to be doing a separate video on just the darts after I get through putting them through some more tests. I think that's enough banter. Let's go ahead and get outside to the ranges. This is test number 1 with stock Elite darts. I'm going to do a combination of 3 level and 3 angled shots. And the angled shots. Whoa. And there we are. The stability issues with the darts weren't quite as bad as I was expecting them to be. The level shots specifically all landed here very close together. Here is 53 feet for our first dart, and that's probably about 10 feet over what the average ranges I was getting with in stock form. 57 here, we have one more, and the final dart right here at 58 feet, so everything very nicely grouped together. And then the angled shots really sailed, and I will see if I can track them down. I believe they are all past the 100 foot marker. There's 100 feet, and let's see, I've got one over here. This is probably about 120 feet and a good 10 feet off from the side of the tape. I've got another one right here at probably about 135 feet, and that one is only about 2 foot off of center. And then we have the third dart here, and that's probably about 5 feet closer than the last dart and probably about 6 or 7 feet off from the side of the tape. So the ranges are looking really good, and the accuracy was actually much better than I expected, especially without using weighted darts. So let's move on to the next test. This is test number 2 using the lightly weighted Elite stingers. Again, I'm going to do a combination of 3 level and 3 angled shots. And there we are. Results seem to be very similar to the stock Elite dart tests. However, there did seem to be less wobble in the darts. Looks like we have our level shots. Here's one at 51 feet. Here's another one at 52. And here's our third level shot at 64. So it looks like it may have taken just a little bit off the overall range. But personally, I think it's a fair trade-off for slightly better accuracy. And our angled darts, it looks like the first one is right here, probably sitting at about 105. There's the end of the tape, and that's probably about 3 feet off from the side. And then the other two are actually sitting here almost directly past the end of the tape. This is one sitting at probably about 120, and that's about a foot off. And then here's one directly behind the end of the tape, and this is probably sitting close to about 130 feet. This is test number 3 using our 50 cal slugs. Once again, I'll be doing 3 level and 3 angled shots. And there we are. Looks like we've got a pretty good grouping down here for the level shots. We've got one here directly at 53 feet, one at 54 feet, and you can see how close they all are to the tape, and one at 59, so pretty comparable ranges to the first test. And now we should be coming up on our angled shots. Looks like I've got one here just past the 100-foot mark and right next to the tape. I've got one more sitting here just to the right of the tape, and that's probably at about 104. And then I have dart number 3, and it is lined up almost perfectly with the end of the tape, and that's probably sitting at about 120, 125 feet. So personally, I'm very happy with the way this blaster turned out. If you guys like the video, please subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.